Okay, good morning. So today we're going to basically finish talking about the evidence on returns to healthcare spending in terms of improved health. I did post a problem set between last lecture and now, which is due I think like next Friday. And then the plan is, so I guess, let's see, next a week from this following Friday, I guess it's the last week before Thanksgiving, we have Thanksgiving week. So I'll probably do like one last problem set that will come out maybe shortly before Thanksgiving, and then do like the last week of classes, or maybe like the first day of triple R or something like that. And that should be it in terms of the problem sets. In terms of the lecture, so I think we'll definitely have a review session. Most likely, before the final, most likely the review session will probably be like maybe the first lecture or the first class time during the triple R week. I don't think we're going to use all three, but I'll probably use one of them for review and cover material through the last normal lecture. Okay, so when we stopped talking last time, I was mentioning this paper that basically documents that there's like substantial differences in Medicare spending per enrollee, so per person in Medicare across regions. And despite the fact that some regions spend a lot more per person and some regions spend a lot less per enrollee, the spending doesn't correlate with a number of things that you might think or hope that it would correlate with. So it doesn't seem to correlate with more effective care. It doesn't seem to, which is probably a bad thing. You would ideally like it to be the case that you're spending more, you're sort of getting more. It doesn't seem to correlate with more elective surgery, which is maybe a good thing in the sense that we're probably doing too much surgery on the margin anyway. And it doesn't seem to correlate with better health outcomes, which would probably be a bad thing in the sense that you would like to see sort of better outcomes for more spending. So in terms of like accounting for documenting what it does actually, like what seems to contribute to the higher spending levels, there's sort of a broad variety of factors, but it particularly seems to be related to specialist visits. So the areas that spend more relative to those that spend less, basically what they observe in the data are there are more physician visits per enrollee, there are more specialist consultations. So this is like you go to your GP or like general or your primary care physician, and they might sort of think, okay, well, I think something wrong with you, maybe it's related to your like kidney or something like that. So then they refer you like to a kidney specialist, and then you go and get the consultation. And I mean, the thing with specialists is they specialize in particular things. So like if you get referred to somebody who does kidneys, then if they have any diagnosis, it's going to be about kidneys. I mean, they might say like there's nothing wrong with your kidneys and sort of send you back to your primary care physician. But if the real problem is with something else, it's unlikely they're going to diagnose that because that's that's not their specialty. So you could potentially have sort of many specialist consultations for one particular illness, depending on sort of how long it took for them to conclude that your diagnosis was related to one particular area of the body. So these consultations seem to be particularly concentrated for chronic diseases and for the last 6 months of life. So this is where sort of the incremental Medicare dollar appears to go. So like basically the regions that are spending more per enrollee, a lot of that additional spending is going into spending that occurs during the last year or even just the last 6 months of life. And the differences are quite large. So a 65-year-old in Miami, which is one of the like higher spending areas, is basically they're going to, in expectation over their lifetime, so really from 65 to whenever they die, are likely to spend about $50,000 more, again in expectation, than a 65-year-old in Minneapolis, which is one of the lower spending areas. So that's a pretty substantial difference. Again, because this is in expectation. So in reality, there's going to be an entire distribution of spending, and so some of these, some sort of 65-year-olds in Miami will not have spending that's any higher than what they would have had if they were in Minneapolis instead. But for others of them, they might well exceed sort of more than $50,000 difference. It might be $100,000 or $200,000 or $500,000 difference. This is just getting averaged out across the entire populations of 65-year-olds in each of those cities. So a lot of the additional spending is going into what we sort of call end-of-life spending, and the problem with that is that it's very hard to sort of quantify what the value is. If you just look in the data, it turns out that the local supply of specialists and acute care hospitals explain about 41% of the variation in end-of-life intensity. So this is like intensity of spending during the last year. So what this is saying is that basically, if you sort of ran a regression where you had sort of intensity of spending during the last like 6 months or 12 months of life by region, and you regress that on the supply of specialists and the supply of acute care hospitals, that you would end up explaining almost half of the variation in end-of-life intensity and spending. So that's sort of by the standards of like cross-sectional regressions, that turns out to be like a very high what we call that basically you're able to explain a surprisingly large amount of the variation in intensity of end-of-life spending just with those variables. So that's sort of suggestive of sort of what we call like sort of supply side medicine. So the idea is like essentially that if you have specialists or if you have these hospitals, then you're going to use them regardless of whether or not the patients actually sort of have a preference for that. I mean, I guess if you've ever seen like the movie Field of Dreams, it's sort of like they say the like tagline of that movie is like if you build it, they will come, because he builds this like baseball stadium in the middle of nowhere, and the idea is like people just come and fill it up. So this is in a more realistic context, basically the same idea that basically if you build this big hospital where you can put all these people, then you'll just fill it up with people, and whether or not, so regardless of whether or not it might be medically necessary or sort of cost effective to put people in there. So that's one interpretation of like this relationship, of this correlation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like it's not the only interpretation. So certainly you could have essentially reverse causality, which is to say that for whatever reason it might be the case that people in these high spending areas actually want more intensive care at the end of their lives, and therefore the sort of supply side of the medical industry is just responding to that and providing more specialists and more hospital beds in those areas. So in those areas, like it's not like it's a suggestive relationship, but it's not like we've randomly assigned specialists and randomly assigned acute care hospitals across regions and then looked at what happens in those regions. It could be that there's actually sort of demand that's driving supply here. So the same thing holds for basically preference-sensitive care. So this is referring to cases in which there are sort of more than one potential alternative treatments for a given condition, and it's, at that point it's up to the patient which treatment they want to do. So the idea here is essentially that presumably what should happen is if you have a particular condition where there are two treatments, neither of which is necessarily sort of like neither of which really dominates the other in a clinical sense, so they both seem to be effective, then presumably what the doctor should do is present those two options to the patient when they're deciding whether or not they want to get a specific treatment, and then the patient would make the decision based on sort of their own preferences. So like maybe one case would be somebody has some sort of injury that is kind of on the margin where like you might require surgery but you might not, and so you could have sort of a surgical intervention to go in, put in a plate or something for a broken bone or broken elbow or something, versus having just more conservative sort of setting it, letting it heal on its own, and then doing like physical therapy and stuff like that. So presumably the doctor could present both options to the patient, and they would sort of decide based on their preferences of whether or not they wanted to undergo surgery and potentially like the cost that they faced if they had a high deductible plan or something that wasn't shielding them from all the costs and so forth, and the patient would make an informed decision based on their own preferences. So ideally, that's what you would sort of like to think is happening in those cases. But essentially what you sort of see in the aggregate level of the data is that when people have these specific conditions in various areas, they end up choosing the option that has like that basically has a lot of supply side potential in that area. So if you're in an area where there's lots and lots of surgeons and you get the sort of the choice, you have a particular condition that might or might not basically that, like, it's not clear whether or not you need surgery. It's an option for treatment, but it's certainly not the only option. It doesn't clinically dominate the other options necessarily. So in theory, you should be making an informed choice. But in practice, what we see is that if you're in an area where there's lots and lots of surgeons, then you end up choosing surgery. Again, the causality isn't 100% clear there. So the sort of supply side story would be that your doctors presumably sort of push you towards surgery because there are so many surgeons, or maybe it doesn't even have to be that like that sort of nefarious. It may be that essentially what they'll do is refer you to specialists, and they always are referring you to surgeons because that's those are the specialists there. And if you get referred to a surgeon, it's likely that the surgeon is going to recommend surgery because that's what they do, right? So it's not like they're necessarily sort of coming in and actively thinking like, yes, I must steer them towards this option because that's what all my friends do, and I have some sort of kickback scheme with them or something like that. I think it can potentially be more subtle than that. But it does seem that if you have sort of a lot of supply of that particular type of treatment option, then people in those areas end up choosing that treatment option. You could, if this were like if this were sort of a normal market that wasn't the health insurance or the healthcare market, then that pattern wouldn't be surprising because you would think that there's a lot of supply of a particular factor or a particular good, then the price gets driven down, and so people will start choosing that good over another good. In this case, though, that seems sort of less realistic again because the patients tend to be insulated from the price since they're covered under insurance. So it's not so clear that what would be going on is just that wherever there's a large supply of surgeons, that the price of surgery would go down, and patients respond to that. Now again, the story that would be less, I guess, sort of better welfare implications would be again that the patient has, for whatever reason, there's sort of like clustering in patient preferences, and so in some areas they prefer like one treatment over another treatment, and then the supply side is just responding again to demand by patients for that specific type of treatment in that area, which technically is a possibility, but again it sort of seems unlikely that there would be that dramatic sort of regional variation in preference for a particular type of treatment. It also turns out the overall supply of hospitals predicts the probability of dying in a hospital. Sadly, turns out the personal preference or the stated personal preference for dying at home versus in a hospital does not predict the probability that somebody dies in a hospital. So that again is sort of suggestive that there's sort of the supply side effect going on rather than sort of patient preferences determining what actually happens. And finally, the expenditure level in the last 6 months does not seem to have any relationship with life expectancy. So ideally, if you're having all of these intensive interventions at the end, you would hope that would be extending life, and perhaps it is, but it's not really showing up in the data. So there's sort of not a lot of evidence that intense spending near the end of life generates substantial benefits. So the average expenditures. So if you just look in the data, if you just sort of look at expenditures so if you sort of have a sample of people who have all died, and you actually track what is being how much medical expenditures are going towards each of them at various stages of their life, it turns out that for probably the majority of your sample, the average expenditures during the last 6 months of their lives are going to be very high. And so if you sort of look at that pattern, you might be tempted to conclude that we're spending a lot of money, and yet they're dying anyway. So sort of why spend so much if they don't make it anyway? The problem with concluding that just from sort of the data that I described right there is that you can't actually predict who's going to make it and who won't. So if you thought that perhaps, so say that you had these intensive interventions that were expensive and they weren't all that successful on average. So the majority of times, despite spending a lot of money, people died. Even if it were just the case that maybe 20%, so 1 in 5 of individuals, got an extra, say, 5 or 10 years of life, you might sort of conclude that the expenditures would be justified in that scenario just because the VSL is so higher. In this case, since we're sort of talking about relatively old people, you probably wouldn't want to use the overall VSL that we've discussed, which was in the range of several $1 million. You're probably more focusing on sort of the value of a statistical life year at this point, which we're talking about being in the range of maybe $100,000 to $200,000. But even there, if you're talking about $100,000 or something for a life year, multiplied by 5 or 10, that's adding up to real money. And so if it were the case that having these intensive expenditures, these intensive interventions, ended up, say, extending somebody's life by 5 or 10 years, even just 1 out of 5 times, so 4 out of 5 times the person dies anyway, maybe 1 out of 5 times they end up living longer, that still might be worth it just based on sort of the value of a life year that we've discussed previously in class. However, so I should also say then, in that case, what I described in the data would still be the case that when you look at everybody who had died, you would always be observing, or you would generally be observing, that they had high levels of expenditures late in their life, and obviously that didn't prevent them from dying. But that wouldn't necessarily imply that it never prevented anybody from dying, because if you had so basically you had some sort of serious illness, and we poured a lot of money into treating you, and we ended up curing you, then you wouldn't end up in our data as somebody who would die. You would actually continue living for another 5 or 10 years, and then maybe die of something else later. And what we would presumably see is that at some point earlier in your life there were intensive expenditures, and presumably they were successful in terms of extending your life. But the fact that in some cases we're successful isn't going to prevent us from observing that in many cases there's high expenditures in life that aren't successful in extending life. That being said, if it were the case that these intensive interventions were actually extending life for some people, then you would hope that the regions that are spending large amounts of the last 6 months of life should have longer life expectancies. You don't really observe that in the data. So it's basically either too small to detect, or those that can benefit are getting treated in the lower expenditure areas anyway. So if it's just a case that there's if you actually have the ability to sort of figure out who is more likely to benefit from the spending and who is less likely to benefit from the spending, then maybe in the lower spending areas they're only spending on those who are likely to benefit and not spending on those who are less likely to benefit. And then the higher spend areas they just spend on everybody, and they sort of get all the benefits that you do see in the low spending areas, but then also spend on people who don't see any benefits as well. So one of the big sort of drivers in cost is actually the introduction of essentially new medical technology. So typically, we think of technological advances as being a good thing, and here they are as well. I mean, you are getting additional value, presumably, if the new technology actually does something in terms of improving health. The problem sort of in, I guess the thing that's sort of different, at least over the past, 5 decades at least or so, in medicine relative to other areas, is that in general, sort of new technology, does improve health, but usually doesn't end up lowering costs. So if you look at a lot of industries, when you get new technology, it has sort of the dual benefit of both improving the product and reducing costs. So there's the easiest example of that probably is the sort of computer hardware industry and semiconductors, where computers today are they cost substantially less than they did 10 or 20 years ago, and yet are an order of magnitude more capable. So there you sort of have technology advancing so rapidly that costs are actually dropping even as the product gets better. And I think that's true to a substantial degree in a lot of cases. So like cars, I guess probably in nominal prices haven't really changed. In real prices, they might have actually come down, and certainly they're sort of getting better. They're definitely getting better, at least without rising in terms of real prices. So in a lot of industries, it's like technology will both lower costs and improve the product. In healthcare, it can improve the product in the sense that it can give you better health, but it typically doesn't end up lowering the cost. So we invent new procedures. These new procedures cost more than the old ones. They're more effective, hopefully, but they are more costly. So key question is whether or not the improvements are necessarily worth the cost. So in the Cutler and Richardson paper, what they do is they compare the total increase in healthcare spending to the total value of increased lifespan and quality of life over sort of a 20-year period. And so what they do to sort of measure, so increased lifespan, is pretty easy to measure in the sense that you can just look at how life expectancies are changing year over year in the country. Quality of life is a much more sort of subjective, concept. And so in order to measure that, they come up with something they call the health capital stock at a given age. And so that is basically based on what they call, so there's this term called quality adjusted life years remaining for a person of a particular age. So they're going to measure this, or they're going to create an estimate of what they're calling quality adjusted life years. So basically what they're taking is the number of life years remaining, and then they're going to sort of downweight or reduce some of the life years if they expect that you'll have a lower quality of life during those years. So that sort of maximum number of quality adjusted life years that somebody could have would just be equal to their expected life years remaining. That would be if there was sort of no quality adjustment at all. So basically if you're going to be like perfectly healthy right up until the time you died, and then you just died. But for most people, the sort of quality adjusted life years that you would have an expectation remaining are going to be somewhat lower than your actual life years remaining, just because your quality of life tends to decline as you get older, and particularly like very late in life. Right? So in order to do this quality adjustment, basically what they do is they look at the prevalence of morbidity prevalence statistics. That just refers to sort of the prevalence of different types of diseases in the population, and then life tables. So life tables are what they use to calculate life expectancies. They look at the percentage of people at a given age who are alive in the population at a given time. And then they have to, so they basically, they know how long people are going to live, or they have an expectation of how long people are going to be living at any given point in time, and they know the prevalence of a bunch of different sort of major diseases, and so they can sort of compute these quality adjusted life years as long as they can kind of attach some sort of quality adjustment to each disease. So the key question here is like, so if you're alive but you have heart disease, or if you're alive but you have diabetes, or if you're alive but you have like cancer, how much should we sort of quality adjust or downweight your each life year based on the reduced quality of life that's associated with each of those diseases. And so in order to sort of attach what we're going to call a weight here to each disease, like an adjustment for each disease, what they're going to do is they run regressions of self-reported health on the disease indicators. So the idea here is that basically you have some sort of self-reported health measure. So this is where they'll ask you to rate on, say, a scale of like 1 to 5, how healthy you feel in sort of everyday activities and so forth. And so they're going to have a sample of people, like a pretty large sample of people. Each person is going to report what their self-reported health measure is. And they're going to then take that measure. So let's say that 5 is the healthiest and 1 is the least healthy. So increasing the higher level of the measure means that people feel healthier. They're going to take that measure and they're going to regress it on a bunch of indicators for whether or not a given person has that disease. So the idea here is that presumably if you have no diseases at all, on average, your self-reported health is going to be better than, say, the self-reported health for people who have heart disease, or the self-reported health for people who have diabetes. And so when you run that regression of self-reported health on indicator variables for each of these diseases, you're going to get a coefficient on each of those indicator variables, and you can interpret that coefficient as sort of having some sort of relationship or sort of representing, in some sense, the reduced perception of health that's associated with having that specific disease. So if you had your regression that was like, there's a variable which we'll call self-reported health, so I'm just going to index that with I because it's going to, we have a sample of people who we're indexing with the letter I there. So self-reported health for individual I is going to be equal to beta naught, which is just going to be sort of the mean level of self-reported health for people who don't have any disease. Let's say beta 1 times an indicator for whether or not person I has heart disease, plus say beta 2 times an indicator for whether or not they have diabetes, plus beta 3 times an indicator for whether or not they have cancer. Really, in reality, you're breaking it down into like a lot of different types of cancers, because some cancers are going to have much lower impact on quality of life than others, and so forth. So you end up actually having a whole bunch of different indicators in here for lots and lots of different diseases. If it's a rare enough disease, there's no point really putting it in. But for all those sort of more common illnesses, particularly chronic illnesses that happen later in life, you're going to put an indicator there. You have a bunch of variables, and then a residual term epsilon I, which is all of the variation in self-reported health that isn't explained by all these different disease indicators. And so, like if you see a big negative coefficient here on heart disease, what that means is that sort of heart disease seems to have, so say that there's a big negative coefficient on heart disease, and that it happens to be, say, larger than the coefficient on diabetes. So to the extent that that beta 1 is much larger in magnitude than the beta 2 there, what that's going to indicate presumably is that heart disease has a bigger impact on your quality of life than diabetes does. And so they're going to use all the regression coefficients that they get from this regression to basically assign a quality of life adjustment for each disease, right? So then at the end of the day, then they know the prevalence of each of the diseases in the overall population, and so they can kind of adjust for quality of life based on all of the different diseases. So if heart disease is pretty common, then you're going to end up reducing quality of life for a lot of people, assuming that you get a sort of large and negative beta 1 coefficient there. So they're going to compute this quality adjusted life year measure in 1970 and then again in 1990. So that's like a 20-year span during which medical technology improved, and also during which, of course, spending not improved but grew larger. And so then they want to sort of compare the increase